My name is Tim Rugh, Executive Director of 3A Sanitary Standards, Inc. On behalf of our leadership, our education committee, and our faculty, I want to welcome you to our webinar series. These webinars were originally presented as part of our 2022 education program designed to clean, creating a hygiene-focused culture. We welcome you today to join a truly diverse group from across the United States and around the world who share a common interest in hygienic equipment design. Our participants include those who fabricate the equipment, those who use it, and those who are responsible for inspecting equipment and facilities. We especially welcome those who are participating for the first time in a 3A SSI event. Let me also recognize and thank the sponsors of 3A SSI. These companies have stepped up to show their support for the education mission of 3A SSI with a sponsored link on our website. Their support helps make this webinar possible, along with many other vital education resources. Follow the company link on our website and visit these companies for more about their hygienic products and services. Since many participants joining us today are new to 3A SSI, let me share a very brief history about the organization. In the 1920s, 2 trade associations and 1 professional association formulated uniform standards for fittings used on milk pipelines. The standards became popularly known as 3A for the 3 associations. This cooperation between industry and regulatory experts continued over the decades, and in 1944, the U.S. Public Health Service, which oversees the FDA, announced it would collaborate in developing uniform equipment standards. In 1956, the 3A symbol was introduced as a legal trademark for display on equipment that conforms to a 3A standard and other conditions of licensing. Through many decades, the number of 3A standards and accepted practices increased in number and in complexity. Today, we oversee an inventory of about 80 standards for equipment and accepted practices for processing systems. In 2002, this network of informal collaboration became organized in a modern, not-for-profit 501c3 corporation. We are headquartered in McLean, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. This is probably one of the most important slides you'll see today because it conveys the long history of 3A and the important role it serves in supporting regulatory programs in the dairy industry. Now, as we head into the 2020s, 3A is entering the 2nd century of service to the food processing industry. That's a long and rich history. Today, 3A SSI has 3 member associations that represent the same stakeholder groups of years past: fabricators, processors, and regulatory sanitarians. The Food Processing Suppliers Association is the trade association for suppliers to the food processing and packaging industry, with more than 400 members serving a broad spectrum of industries, including bakery, beverage, dairy, meat, pet food, and prepared foods. The International Dairy Foods Association represents the nation's dairy manufacturing and marketing industry, with a diverse membership ranging from multinational organizations to single plant companies, from dairy companies and cooperatives to food retailers and suppliers. IEFP is a member-based association of more than 4,500 food safety professionals committed to advancing food safety worldwide by providing food safety professionals with a forum to exchange information on protecting the food supply. The 3A SSI Board of Directors is composed of voting representatives from these associations, plus representatives of USDA and FDA, and the chair of the 3A Steering Committee. This is the committee responsible for overseeing all 3A standards activities. All of the corporate activities are now carried out by a single organization with its own governance structure and a dedicated professional staff. The support for 3A SSI operations comes mainly from the licensing program, sales of documents, meetings, and dues. 3A SSI today has vastly expanded and modernized its programs and resources dedicated to hygienic design, particularly in the past 2 decades. One of the driving forces for the new 3A SSI was to improve the integrity of the 3A symbol program used to identify equipment that conforms to a 3A sanitary standard. As we look to the future, I'm reminded of a widely known and well-regarded speaker who said something to the effect of, "Standards are good, but you don't need 3A. Sounds a little dismissive, but it's probably true. To be fair, there are many other voluntary guidelines and standards available, also very good, but you may not need them either. It's up to you to learn about what you do need. It all begins with sound education. It's worth pointing out that 3A is not strictly US, nor is it exclusively dairy. We note that of the 3A symbol authorizations on file with us, about 48% are held by US entities and 52% are held by international entities. The 3A symbol authorizations and certificates held by companies span about 22 countries outside the United States. We also see that 3A SSI document sales reach a very diverse group of customers in 40 countries outside the United States. And these are companies that are certainly outside of the dairy industry, including beverages, pet foods, cereals, personal care products, wine, beer, and many other types of food applications. We also know that the key drivers for hygienic equipment design are US dairy regulations, the Food Modernization Act, and corporate requirements. Looking across the landscape of other standards developers, 3A SSI offers a highly respected network of subject experts in hygienic design and high-value education and training resources. Thank you for taking advantage of this education opportunity today. Before we begin, we urge you to explore the Knowledge Center and build these resources into your personal education or organization training programs. Here you'll find 4 basic e-learning modules on hygienic design and 1 advanced module, all at no charge. They're designed for all audiences, including equipment fabricators, food processors, regulatory sanitarians, as well as students and young professionals beginning their careers. No previous knowledge of hygienic design or a given topic is required. The 3A Sanitary Standard for General Requirements, or simply the General Requirements, is a compendium of terminology and requirements which are common to our standards and accepted practices. You may hear references to these requirements in today's webinar. This document is essential if you do plan to utilize 3A SSI resources for your future training and education. This document is available for purchase from 3A SSI through the link on our homepage. Don't forget to mark your calendar to join us for in-person education and networking next May in Bloomington, Minnesota. We'll have 2 days of education beginning with a special introduction to the foundations of hygienic design, followed by a day of special topics. We'll also conduct our annual meeting and work group meetings. Watch our website for the program schedule and details later this year. So let's begin today's presentations. Remember, the presentations you are viewing today are not live, but we still invite your questions or comments on the content. Please use the email you received with the access code for this program to submit your questions. We'll provide a response to your question from the presenter. You can also contact any 3A SSI staff member about other subjects. Now let us begin today's webinar.
Thank you, guys. I really want to thank 3A and Tim for this opportunity. You know, these days can be long, a lot of speakers, a lot of stuff happening. But as you're sitting there, and I realize there's a part of the room that cannot see this, but I want you to look up and see those eyes. Do you see those cat's eyes right there? Those eyes are looking at you saying, is this food safe? Can I trust you? Oh, I do trust you, and now I'm going to eat. So when you're in that moment, when you're ready to sleep today or you get bored, look at those eyes, because those eyes are calling you to pay attention, like any good cat's eyes does, I guess. All right, so, you know, I mentioned I am honored to be here with 3A. I spent much of my career in dairy, especially the early part. Actually, I grew up on a dairy farm, so whoever asked that question yesterday, my hand's up. And then ironically, later in my career, I was a plant manager for the plant that the milk we produced when I was a kid went to. I ended up managing that plant later in life, which is this weird circle that happened. But I learned about hygienic design and design, really a lot of it early on from 3A. 3A standards, I had those printed out. I knew them very well. Between that and the PMO, those were my references. And, you know, that really impacted a lot of items that I worked on when I was in sanitation role, a regional sanitation role. And it also, at one point in the late 90s when meat was going through a challenge, there was a point, and you can call me extremely naive at that point. I had an engineer that we were working through some design in the meat plants, and an engineer asked me, well, what do I follow to get this right? You guys keep talking about hygienic design. What do I follow? And in my youthful exuberance, ignorance, whatever you want to call it, I said, well, follow the 3A standards. And he said, well, how do I make a piece of meat equipment following a dairy filler standard? Yeah, it's a good question, sir. Let me get back to you in about 3 years. Obviously, 3A has expanded that. That was in the late 90s, and now it goes much more across industries. But that was the start of the point where I realized hygienic design, and you could glean from those standards more, and that's kind of where I was leading, but to expect someone who at the time was just trying to get things done to go glean from those standards and translate it really didn't make sense. But what I learned then was, you know, when we talk about hygienic design, and then today we're going to talk about culture too, those are two spaces where there is no exact roadmap. There's no exact roadmap to get to hygienic design, and there's no exact roadmap to get to culture. We know what bad looks like on both accounts, but there's many ways to get there, and there's many perspectives on how to get there, and depending on all the other variables, the products and the plant and all these things, it drives a different approach. So it's really important to understand what you're dealing with and kind of have those concepts down. So when we're looking at today's theme here, there's a couple things I want to point out. One is at the end of this statement, designed to clean, creating a hygiene-focused culture, is that term culture. And so I want you to think of it as like a base. And at the front of it is design. So when we talk about creating that culture, and when we talk about design, when we talk about a design, it's because things are changing. If everything were left the same, right, no reason to have this discussion or these last couple days, because it's all about making improvement. So design is part of a change. And what I would like you to walk away from here is understanding that when you create change, that's when you impact the culture. So leveraging that change to improve your culture is the great opportunity that's out here. So how do you drive culture improvement through design, essentially? And I will say, maybe a disclaimer a little bit, I spent much of my career in operations. And so a fair amount of my perspective is from the operations perspective. And I realize we not only have people from operations here, we have OEMs, we have regulatory, we have a lot of different folks here from different areas. And so if I don't translate directly to your area, I apologize up front, but I'm going to ask you to translate what I'm talking through and how that applies to you. So please do that, because I think it's important. Ultimately, we're trying to make an impact in operations and improve food safety. So a question, which of these vehicles is quicker to 60? Okay, who says the race car? One person, the rest of you, seriously guys. Okay, let's try this again. Who says the race car? Okay, who says the pickup truck? Oh my goodness, a lot of pickup trucks. What's with you guys? Why would you say the pickup truck?
It depends on the road. It's a Rivian.
Okay, it's a Rivian. Someone knew it was electric. Okay. So yeah, historically we would say, well, of course the Ferrari is faster to 60. It's a Ferrari, that's all they've done their whole career, their whole life, their whole purpose for being is speed. And the pickup truck is for carrying 2x4s. But, of course, that perspective is looking at the shell and history. But the reality is what's under the hood, in this case, in both cases, is space, because there is nothing under either hood. But what's running the vehicle is different technology. So the Ferrari is a traditional, gas-powered engine, and the truck is an electric vehicle. So in this case, actually, the race car was still probably right, because this is one of the few Ferraris that can beat the Rivian to 60 by about 1/10 of a second. But the vast majority of Ferraris out there could beat this vehicle, or would lose to the Rivian. So it's a different perspective, and that's what I'm asking to look at for design, is a different perspective. So the truck, pickup truck, obviously is slower than a race car if you ask it just that way without any picture or anything. But the reality is our perspectives has changed because technology has changed. And so we need to adjust on that. So with design, I'm asking you to look at it from a different perspective. So I want to tell a little story about probably one of the best operators that I ever worked with. I was a business unit manager in a plant, and we were going through expansion quite aggressively because we had launched a product that sold insanely fast, and we were on allocation for like 9 months. So we immediately went into how are we going to expand, how are we going to increase capacity. The best operator, one of the best operators I ever worked with, worked on one of the line that was actually producing this product. And so we were retrofitting and building a whole new line to repeat the capabilities of what that product was. His name was Richie. Richie had worked on that line for as long as the line had been in. He'd been in the plant about 30 plus years. And everybody went to Richie for questions on that specific line. But I want to paint more of a picture on Richie. Richie was also the guy who would sit in the break room and eat raw hamburger. And if you want to get fancy, call it steak tartare. But it was raw hamburger he had bought from the grocery store in a little town he lived in way northern New York. They just drew a line wrong on the map. It would have been southern Canada. Richie would gum the hamburger because his dentures were next to the plate. He never went past 5th grade in school. So anybody walking into the plant, they would make a judgment call on Richie. But I knew better. This guy was amazing. In fact, I knew about it prior to taking the job in this plant because he had helped us avoid a recall in that facility months earlier that I had been involved in investigating. So during this expansion, we opened it up to the plant. Anybody who wanted to be involved in the project team could get involved, and Richie, fortunately, signed on for that. So Richie, who had never been outside of 2 counties in northern New York, got involved in this project team. And so the engineering manager and myself, we were going to the equipment manufacturer, and we took Richie with us, the best operator. Why not? So we went and we got on one plane and then a second flight to get down to where we were going. And we're sitting on this plane, and I'll never forget looking at Richie, and he's in the chair, and he's got this little bag up to his mouth. And, it's that famous barf bag. I don't think he ever used it, fortunately. But he had obviously never flown. He'd never been out of those 2 counties. We get to the equipment manufacturer, and we're sitting in this meeting. And at this point in the project, it's drawing review. And so they had the drawings out. We were going through everything. And Richie had this idea. He had this idea of how to modify how you access the fill heads so that it improved people safety. It reduced the time of turnaround like crazy. And he had that idea. And the equipment manufacturer pushed back, and we asked them to please consider it. They came back a week later with an option, which we bought. And that option paid for itself within 2 weeks, easily. And that was all from an idea, which wasn't his only idea, but that was one of the ideas Richie had, the guy who never made it to 6th grade in school. So I want to step back for a moment, and I'll get back to Richie. But I talked about how design creates, and the only reason I actually do design is because of, what's this symbol? Delta. So it's the change, it's the difference. And so wherever you are initially to where you're going, that difference is generated from the change you make. And the question is, when you make change, what do you get? So what's the impact to the people? What's the impact to the culture? And so we know that when you change, you're either trying to decrease something or increase something, you know? And just bear with me. I realize this is an absolute hard fact but directionally, this is absolutely correct. So you're trying to reduce something, you're trying to increase something. And the reduction could be risk, it could be people, labor, maintenance time. You know, you're trying to reduce downtime, whatever. When you're trying to, and in this case, we'll focus on risk because it's food safety focused. And I'm going to challenge that when you increase something, even though you're saying, hey, I want to increase capacity, capability, whatever it is you're trying to increase with that change, you have an opportunity to maximize what you're doing. So in our case, in that example with Richie, we're trying to take what we could make from, let's just say 100 cups an hour we could make. And we were trying to take it to 1,000 cups an hour. Slowest running machine ever, but just bear with the false numbers. So we could have said that's our only goal, is to do that, is to increase that. But really, again, what's our goal at the end is culture, impact the culture. So I'm going to circle back to that topic again. Design at opportunity that the change is caused by design changes is you're going to affect that culture. So how do you maximize the opportunity? And when you have an opportunity to create change and make something better, who's shooting for, hey, I just want to be barely good enough? Like, let's shoot for mediocre. Anybody rallying cries here? Is this like company taglines? So no, I hope not. But why not maximize the opportunity to be great? So when you change, why change? You don't change to be mediocre. Of course you're going to try to reduce your risk, but why not try to maximize the opportunity to be great? And in order to do that, you really need to design to be great. Again, you're not designing to be mediocre. Let's design to be great. So now back to Richie again. When, back when Richie we were going through this, it was a few years ago, and iPhones were a glimmer probably in Steve Jobs' eyes, I'm guessing. But they certainly weren't around. But I'm thinking, If I would have reached out to Richie at that time and texted him and said, hey, Richie, tell me how you're feeling after this project, I'm thinking he would have picked this emoji. Like, he would have been on it saying, I'm there, this is good. And I think the whole team would have been, because they knew why the change was happening. They knew what our targets were. They were involved. They had input. Not everything was followed. You know, not every idea that ever comes up is implemented. But a lot of stuff was done, and I have absolutely no doubt, and I'm sure they don't have any doubt either, that the project turned out better with their input, with the operators, the cross-functional group, the maintenance group. It's so much better with that group than it would have been had a couple leaders in the plant and an engineer sat in a room and done it. There is no question that group did a better job. So I'm feeling comfortable. I can't ask Richie anymore, he's passed away. But I'm pretty sure he would have sent me that. Now, let's think about when we have change, though, going on. What are the other things that happen in the plant? What are the other emojis we could get? And so I'll keep it clean, but there's one that I feel like could happen for sure. I've had discussions with people in plants, and they don't really know they didn't know the change was coming. They didn't know why the change. They don't really know what the impact's going to be. They don't even know if things are going to get better. So they're kind of in that, maybe not so excited. And then there's the other extreme possibility, which does definitely happen. And this is the one that says I wasn't involved. They may have hit right? Now, always good to hear they in a plant when you're talking about the people you work with. They may have hit their goal of increased capacity. I'll just stick with that. But there's so many other things they missed. They didn't fix the same challenge we've been having for 15 years. They didn't make my job any better. In fact, now I got to deal with this new idea that's out there that makes it harder. And you can picture this person being sanitation, you can picture them being maintenance, and you can even picture them certainly being an operator. So we know what bad is. None of us are shooting for mediocre or worse. So why does this happen sometimes? And it does. It definitely does. So somehow we want to get the right emoji coming back when we're texting people. So let's think about a plant. And in operations, I think manufacturing is absolutely amazing. It doesn't matter if it's food manufacturing or not. It is such a dance of people and product and transportation and logistics, and it's just amazing the inputs and all of that has to happen to get this output. And we even do it through a pandemic. Like, isn't that unbelievable? Hats off to everybody who's been helping the food chain keep going through such a time as this. And so it really is this blank sheet when you're trying to create something new, when you're redesigning or when you're designing new. But you have to take all these complex pieces and put them together, and it's almost like a puzzle. You have these pieces you have to fit together. And when things are thought of right together, they do fit together really well. And then that dance can happen very clean. But there's these things that come up or that are forgotten up front, and then it's this weird piece that never quite fits. And how do you get around that to still operate? You put in processes and procedures that are difficult and hard, and they cost money, and the efficiency of the plant is not what it could be. It's definitely not designed to be great. It's designed to be, in that case, enough to get by. And a lot of times we think of what is that piece, and a lot of them that come up, right, is sanitation. But it could be maintenance, right? They're thought of after the fact, that you don't have good access, you can't tear it down. We heard that from, I think, Larry's examples. I think from other people yesterday, there was examples where accessibility, and that's one of the core components of 3A standards. And, it could be any of those things. And sometimes we get frustrated, like, why is sanitation always forgotten about? This is crazy. You guys drive me nuts. So let's discuss that a little bit, because how should it look when this puzzle's going together? You know, there should be things like production, and these are just examples. It should have safety involved. You know, you got all these things you need to be involved in, including sanitation and all of that. But what is the goal? What is the goal at the end of this? So you're going through all this design, and let's say you even say, okay, we're going to design this to be great. How many plant managers are out there saying, no matter what happens, I just want the best maintenance crew ever. I don't care if we ever make anything out of this. I don't care if product comes out the door. I just want the best maintenance. No, that's not what happens. What they say is, we want a great operation. So all these groups are coming together, and if they're thinking about how do I create a great operation, they're thinking across. And they have their individual skill set and their individual knowledge. They're subject matter experts in areas, and they're pulling it all together. But they're trying to create a puzzle that leads to a great operation, not necessarily just fighting for their own little piece. And that is a big part of why, and the difference between focusing on just hygienic design or just design within your space, and design that takes care of that space, takes care of food safety. It includes the hygienic design standards. It includes that, but it creates a great operation. And you know, if you're in sanitation and if you're not friends with your maintenance people, go become friends, because they help a lot, right? But it's the same across the board. The goal is a great operation. And so I want to talk about this. So if we fight for that red piece, we forget the fact that they're all linked. So what's more important, the red piece or the light blue one right next to it? Right? They're equally important, because either one comes out, it's broken. The dance isn't happening in the plant. And if any one of them's broken, there's a good chance food safety's at risk. As soon as something goes out of whack, right? So if you want to really get it, you get the great operation. And so I'm going to make a proposal here for you guys to think through. So I'm going to say a better design equals a better operation. And if anybody wants to argue that, I just want you to be prepared that if you've ever been in a plant that's a little crazy on design and it looks goofy, and walk away saying, wow, that was a great operation, I would love to hear that story. And so with that, I'm going to also propose that a better operation equals better hygiene. And again, if you've ever been in a plant that there's product all over, there's people going around crazy, and it's just chaos in a plant, and you walked out of there saying, wow, I bet their hygiene and food safety is amazing. Like, these guys are awesome. I can't believe how wacko that was. You know, that doesn't happen. And then I'm going to go further and say better hygiene equals better culture. I was in a board meeting of a multinational company that we were doing a project with, and the president of operations told the story how he was traveling to some of their plants to check on how the progress of the project was. And an operator, he was out on the floor talking to this operator, he'd been 20 plus years in the plant, and the operator said, I am so glad you're doing this. He said, it's so nice to see this plant getting cleaned up, getting invested in, and making the hygiene better. He said, I worked for this company for almost 20 years, and I used to go home and I was so proud of it. And one day I was able to bring my daughter in. And so I brought my daughter in, and I was so proud walking in the doors. I was like, honey, you got to see the plant where I work, and you know, all the time I put into this. And she walked in and she looked and she said, Dad, you make food in here? Yeah, the guy said it hurt. It hurt. Because you think of her, she looks at where she gets food. This young girl, it comes from a clean kitchen. So that's her perspective. That's where food comes from, is a clean kitchen. Or if she goes to a restaurant, right, it's a clean restaurant. And now she walks in this plant that mass produces for the world and it's not a clean kitchen. And this guy was ashamed. He was embarrassed. So here's a guy with a lot of pride in the company, a lot of pride in his plant, that got shamed by his daughter. But he was also proud of them for stepping up and creating a better hygienic situation, at least on, visually. And so I would say better hygiene is a better culture. And it is hard to convince people. We joke a little bit that you've never heard a plant manager or owner or anybody in food say they don't believe in food safety, right? Everybody believes in food safety. It doesn't necessarily show in actions, but they all believe in it. But it's hard to convince an employee that when they hear, I believe in food safety, but then they see something like that girl sees. And they see where the money's being focused on. So better hygiene equals a better culture. And so if I stick with, we used a little math earlier with delta. If I stick with the kind of that A equals B, B equals C type math, therefore, I would propose that better design equals better culture. So again, change forces design to happen, or vice versa at times. Change forces design to happen. You put that effort up front to get design right, you have used that opportunity to improve your culture. To me, that extra work up front with design is similar to, it's springtime, at least in northern New York where I am. I realize some of the part of the country, spring was a few months ago, but it's planting time. It's similar to putting in good tomato seeds or good tomato plants into poor ground and then complaining about the crop of tomatoes in the fall. If you don't get that design right, that's what you're doing. You're missing a whole opportunity to improve that culture and then complain about the culture. But if you can get that ground right, if you can get that design right, use that opportunity with that change, get the people involved and everything, you can improve your culture, and you are reinforcing where you want to go with the hygiene-focused culture. And there are a couple tips I want to share. Smaller things, but I think these are important to consider. And you, again, think like I told you, I'm going to share from a perspective of someone who's been in operations. Think about the operator who's going to work on the floor for 10, 20, 30 years in their perspective. So a couple tips, and they're kind of related. One, make things easier to do right and hard to do wrong. And the other is efficient is best. If you want your operators, you want the people in the plant to be using their brain, their discretionary thought time on improvement ideas, not having to figure out complex scenarios every time they're doing a redundant thing. And if you've been in plants long enough, you know there are people that want to be fast for the sake of fast, but I'm going to look at the good group that wants to do things efficient because they know it's better for the operation, and they want to do them right. They're going to work on doing things easier. They're going to work on doing them more efficient. You want to make sure that is the right thing to do. And you want to make sure things are hard to do wrong, because especially when turnover happens, which there is a lot of churn in plants, and a lot of times in specific areas like sanitation that are so critical to controlling food safety, you want things hard to do wrong that you don't want done. So two, I would say, rather easy concepts that are missed a lot. And they're really good. So I would say to the OEMs out there, please consider these as very, very important. You will help your customers tremendously in a plant. So build that while you're following good hygiene standards. All right, so, you know, we have, well, you guys have the rest of the day yet. We have a day, and you've already heard a lot of technical items, and there's a lot to digest. But here we're talking about culture on top of the design. And culture is not something you can order off the shelf, right? It takes time, it takes transparency, it takes intentionality, it takes diligence to work a culture to where you want it to see improved. And it certainly is a situation where you can spend a lot of time trying to make it better and a very short time screwing it up again. And so that intentionality is very important. And so I'd really encourage you to think through, as you're working through details of standards and details of process and all of that, to try to keep a few things in mind for the future and kind of extrapolate out how this feeds to the future. Today is really good. Yesterday was great. Today's great. The fact you guys here is awesome. It does nothing if next Monday nothing changes. Absolutely nothing. So the secret of this meeting is not this week. It's a month from now, it's 2 years from now, it's 5 years from now. It's the impact all of you can have in these coming days, months, years. So a couple things I would put out there for you to consider. One, become experts and make experts. So this is a great thing. If you haven't been here before, what a great start. I hope you're inspired by the people you have heard yesterday and the ones you'll hear today yet that have really made an impact in this industry. You are seeing some real pillars speak that have left a mark and are leaving a mark in the food industry. And there is not much more you can ask in a life that you leave a mark in something as important as feeding people. So become and make experts. And you know, one of the things we hear is that I don't have time for training. I don't have time for my team to go out for training. And I always think back to when I was at another event speaking, and there was a vice president of a global, very large global food company on the retail side. And we spoke, and then we were fielding questions, and the question came to us about how do you convince, I don't remember exactly, but something about how do you convince an owner or plant manager, a leader, to make change around food safety when they don't buy it. And the VP said something. He didn't really answer the question, but I thought it was a great answer. And I was like, man, I wish I would have thought of that one. But he said, you know, it's amazing, the day after the recall, you have nothing but time to focus on that recall, in spite of the fact the day before the recall you had no time to deal with some of the stuff that was out there. And that leaves a mental picture that whenever you say, you know, I don't have time, or I don't have the resources, or whatever, just think through that to make sure you truly want to make that decision. Use a team. I talked about Richie, but really that approach of getting that cross-functional team, multi-level team involved, get the people involved that are going to use the equipment. OEMs, don't just rely on that one engineer you speak to. You know, that idea of getting that multi-level, multifunctional team is invaluable. And again, designs up front, cultures in the back. If you do that right, you leverage that delta, you leverage that change to affect the culture in a positive way. So if your end game is get that culture right, because it's going to feed back to everything else, get this right. And again, if you're working with customers and they keep it to one, continue to push back and try to get a cross-functional team involved. And think win-win-win. So I talked about how if you're fighting for one group, if you're fighting just for sanitation, if that's all you can speak is, well, you got to do this on this filler because it's a food safety risk. If that's all they hear from you every day forever, I don't think you're maximizing the opportunity for that design change. You want the company to be profitable. You want the company to be successful. You want a great operation, because that great operation is going to lead to better hygiene. So get that design right with a win-win-win approach, and get that design so it drives better culture. Help your maintenance people win. Help your people safety win. Help sanitation win. Help operations win. This isn't an either or. The best facilities get this right, and the best companies get this right. So think win-win-win. So design to be great. Don't design to be mediocre, right? No one's doing that, but design to be great and create that great culture through that. You can do this. It's a big deal. And you too can get that emoji as well. And Richie will smile. So again, remember, as you're going through the day, this is the theme, the title for the day. And it starts with design, but your end game is getting that culture right. That culture is going to protect you, because not everything's going to be perfect. People have to make decisions at stupid hours of the day with stupid little sleep, and they need to make decisions that will impact you and your company a lot more than you think sometimes. I spoke to a president of an operation that was under investigation by the DOJ. There was some deaths involved, and when I was talking to this guy, it hit me like, and he was talking about sanitation. Like, seriously, he was talking about sanitation, which this guy, I'm fairly confident, would have graduated from a marketing school and ended up leading this business. And he probably never thought, one, he would be under investigation by the DOJ, but he never thought he would actually be under investigation from the DOJ because of something and decisions that were made that impacted sanitation, that impacted food safety, and because of design of equipment that he probably didn't even know how it worked. And I'm not discrediting this guy. He was doing his job, what he was trained and taught, growing the business. But there was decisions made, there wasn't a good culture that led to that, and people died. So the fact he was under investigation was probably the smaller impact of that. So you count on people that you will never meet, you'll never see, and getting that design right to create that culture and managing, improving, using that change to improve that culture is critical. So please don't lose that opportunity. And, again, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for your energy and everything. But this is a big deal. Feeding the world is really an honor and a strong responsibility. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning. This is really exciting to be here. It's great to see a full room. For me, this is the very first time that I've been able to present to a room of live people since before the pandemic. In addition to the first time that I've been able to speak to a live audience representing the FDA. So I thank you for the privilege. of being able to speak at the conference and be able to share some of the things that we've had going on. So I've got a lot of slides here. I warn you in advance, there are some citations to regulations in here. Hard to do on a early morning, but we're not going to dwell into that. Hopefully it won't be a snoozer. So the theme, Design to Clean, Creating a Hygiene-Focused Culture. As I thought about this, it really does speak to the work that we've been doing as a regulatory agency over the last 10 years. You know, the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law back in 2011. You know, that's really going to speak strongly to the first part of this, standards for design, creating equipment that can be cleaned. These are all basic foundational food safety principles. And then the second part, creating a hygiene-focused culture, which we just heard a little bit about, that speaks to what our new initiative is, which is the new era of smarter food safety. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of these and share some of the things that we're doing within the FDA and specifically within the Office of Food Safety. So first, most of you have heard and are probably well aware, the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's been around for 10 years. This really enables FDA to better protect public health in a variety of ways. And I'm not going to spend time going into a lot of the things that you've seen hundreds of times before in terms of what all FSMA did. But for the purposes of this, it really focused on the prevention aspect of food safety, creating programs that are going to prevent food safety problems from happening instead of waiting for something to happen and then creating a bunch of change to avoid it from happening again. It did provide FDA with a lot of enforcement tools like mandatory recall, administrative detention, regulatory tools that we didn't have before, tools that were able to hold imported foods to the same standards that we do here domestically in the US. And then it also directed FDA to build an integrated national food safety system utilizing the resources within our state and local authorities. There's been a number of rules that we have finalized over the years related to FSMA. A handful of these, I'm not going to read each one of them, but we are going to spend time talking a little bit deeper about the second one here, the preventive control rule for human foods, and then the one on the bottom, the standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding produce for human consumption, otherwise known as the produce safety rule. We do have a few rules that are out there that are proposed. The comment period is passed on both of these, and we're reviewing those comments at this time. So namely the Ag Water Rule, which would replace a portion of the Produce Safety Rule specific to requirements that would bring a pre-harvest ag water assessment into play. And then the Food Traceability Rule, which if there are certain foods where you fall on the food traceability list, of course this rule would require additional record-keeping requirements around tracing that food through the food system. So, hygienic design. Hygienic design didn't start with FSMA. Hygienic design was already there. The requirement for food contact surfaces to be designed, manufactured, installed, and maintained in a manner to prevent cross-contamination was a GMP before FSMA. It is an underlying principle of FSMA, though, that hazards be identified and controlled. And of course, you can't do this successfully over time without meeting these CGMP requirements. When you look at the Produce Safety Rule, the Produce Safety Rule incorporated a lot of these CGMP requirements into the Produce Safety Rule. And that was namely because the CGMPs in Part 117 don't apply to farms. But that doesn't make these principles any less important for producing safe food. So that's why you'll find a lot of these principles that are in CGMPs in Part 117 in the Produce Safety Rule. And of course, the Produce Safety Rule was the first time that we established science-based minimum standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables. So here are some of the things I clipped out, some of the areas within the Produce Safety Rule that speak to hygienic design. And I'm not going to read each one of these individually, but basically the first one here is talking about using equipment and tools that are of adequate design, construction, and workmanship so that they can be cleaned. The second one is that you have to inspect, maintain, and clean, and when necessary, sanitize all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools that are in covered activities. And remember, a covered activity is growing, harvesting, packing, holding produce as often as you need to protect it against contamination. And we'll come back to this point as we look at some of the next material. And then, of course, it's not just about food contact surfaces. Those non-food contact surfaces are important as well. And if we don't take care of those, then contamination can find its way to a food contact surface. So hygienic design and field equipment. You know, this is one area that we have spent a lot of time talking about recently. And there have been several recent produce-related outbreaks that have involved poor hygienic design on equipment. Classically, we think about hygienic design when we're talking about a processing facility, you know, within the four walls of a manufacturing plant. When we're talking about produce, the realization is this extends out into equipment that is used in the field. Now, a lot of times when you're talking about equipment used to harvest or to pack produce, to transport produce from the field into a packing line, a lot of the surfaces and materials that are used are chosen based on reducing damage to the produce. You know, you don't want to cut it, you don't want to bruise it. That's great for improving yield, reducing loss of the produce, but a lot of times those same materials are not microbiologically cleanable. There has been produce such as lettuce, which is right from the field. You know, lettuce is harvested. A lot of time it's field packed. That goes directly to the grocery store in some cases. Therefore, hygienic design principles have to extend out into these equipment that's being used in the field to handle covered produce. There have been examples recently where pathogens involved in outbreaks have been isolated from this equipment in the field. So therefore, hygienic design in field equipment is a very important area of discussion and should be an increased area of focus going forward. Now, switching into the preventive control rule for human foods, these are a couple of the CGMPs that you would find in subpart B. And just like we saw in the produce safety rule, you know, all plant equipment and utensils must be designed and of such material and workmanship to be adequately cleanable. Again, basic food safety principles. The equipment must be installed. So remember, hygienic design just doesn't, you know, say when it's got to be adequately cleanable from the way it was designed, but also when you install it, if you can't get to it, somebody can't access it to properly clean it, then it's not going to be cleaned well or sufficiently over time. And then the last one, equipment that is in areas where food is manufactured must be so constructed that it can be kept in a clean and sanitary condition. So we've been out doing inspections. Of course, during the pandemic, inspections took a different scope. So I asked that we have some data pulled going back a little further, so pre-pandemic and then through that. So what you see here is data from an inspectional time frame from October 1st of 2019, pretty much to current. So I think it came last week. So this one, and again, remember there are two different inspections that happen under the preventive control rule. There's the limited scope inspections, and these limited scope inspections are going to focus more on the CGMPs. You know, an inspector's probably going to look at the food safety plan. They're going to ask some questions about the food safety plan, but this one is really focused on CGMPs. So what are the top sites from this time period in limited scope preventive control inspections? And the number one, which has been consistent for a long time, is pest control. Pest control, I mean, the evidence is easy to see, right? So it's something that is, if there are issues, it's commonly visible. It tends to always be of site that ranks high on the most frequently cited. The second one here, the short description of it, manufacturing, processing, packing, holding, controls. So what does this mean? Typically when we see sites in this category, it's around the operations weren't maintained in a way to prevent cross-contamination or cross-contact from allergens. The third one, equipment and utensils, design and maintenance. Specifically, this one gets into equipment not being maintained in a way that it can be cleanable. Personnel, that gets to training. And then we find sanitary operations, plant maintenance. Again, is the facility, is the operation being maintained in a way that it can be cleaned? Plant construction and design, again, the next part of it, in a manner that prevents allergen cross-contact or contamination. Sanitation of food contact surfaces, is it happening often enough? You know, when inspectors are in facilities and they see issues with sanitation and they question, is this company, is this firm conducting sanitation on a frequency that is appropriate? Or is their operation getting too unclean between sanitation frequencies? Sanitary facilities, this gets into hand washing, bathrooms, things like that. And then sanitary operations with plant sanitation and training of employees and records. So again, when we talk about hygienic design, when we talk about sanitation and effectively conducting sanitation, you can go through this, and outside of the handful of training and pest control, the majority of what's being cited relates back to, is the equipment cleanable? Is the equipment being cleaned? So then we'll switch and look at the full scope preventive control inspections. And of course, these are going to focus very much on the food safety plan itself. Focus on the hazard analysis, focus on which hazards were identified, which ones require preventive control, and then focusing on the preventive control management components, monitoring, corrective action, verification for those preventive controls. So number one on here, hazard analysis. Did a firm identify a hazard that they should have identified? You know, given their raw materials or given what they're doing in their process, their operation, have they sufficiently identified the hazards that needed to be identified in the hazard analysis? Number two, it just says food safety plan. This site very commonly is issued because firms, typically small or medium-sized firms, do not have a food safety plan. This has been a requirement for some time. Sanitation controls, again, verification procedures. So we'll talk in a slide or two here about environmental monitoring and its usefulness as a verification procedure. But quite often, when inspectors are out and they're looking at sanitation controls, they're looking at the types of preventive controls that firms should have implemented, and sometimes they're not doing environmental monitoring. They haven't identified an environmental hazard as requiring a preventive control, so therefore they're not doing verification. Again, preventive controls, failure to identify a preventive control. So a firm may have identified a hazard, but not done anything or a sufficiently amount to control that hazard. Pest control shows up again. You know, it's easy to see the evidence of pest activity in a facility. So that's very, very commonly up there. The sixth one here, process controls, and we'll just do process controls, monitoring procedures. The seventh one is sanitation control and monitoring procedures. And then you'd see number 10 is allergen controls and monitoring procedures. So essentially, when a firm has identified a hazard, they've identified that it needs a preventive control, but then they're failing to implement proper monitoring to see that that preventive control is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. Okay, so one of the requirements in the preventive control rule, when you're making a ready-to-eat food, when that ready-to-eat food is exposed to the environment, before packaging, and that product is not receiving a treatment in its final packaging, or have a different control measure like formulation that's going to significantly minimize a pathogen, then you have to evaluate in the hazard analysis the potential for environmental pathogen contamination. We define environmental pathogens as Listeria monocytogenes or Salmonella. And so depending on which one of those may be, or both, may be relevant to the facility and the product that is being made, that has to be evaluated within the hazard analysis. And if the determination is made that preventing environmental pathogen contamination in an exposed ready-to-eat food requires a preventive control, then that requires an appropriate control to be a sanitation control. Now, when you implement a sanitation control, part of the requirements for verification then bring in environmental monitoring, and that's where we talked about the site before. We do have a guidance out there. It's been out for a while. This is a draft guidance on control of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods. There's a lot of material. This is a big guidance document, but what you'll find in here in the first part, there is a lot of recommendations around hygienic design and construction of facilities and equipment. And then in the middle of it, there is a section that has recommendations around designing and implementing an environmental monitoring program. So if you're not familiar with this guidance document, or it's been a long time since you've looked at it, this might be one that you go back to and take a look. We don't have a guidance document for Salmonella. What I would tell you is a lot of the recommendations that you're going to find in here for hygienic design are going to be similar or the same for Salmonella, and a lot of the recommendations for establishing an environmental monitoring program are going to be very much the same. So what about not ready-to-eat foods? The requirement there was for ready-to-eat foods, but what about a not ready-to-eat food? Well, the requirement for hygienic design, the requirements in the CGMPs apply to all foods, ready to eat or not ready to eat. Firms making a not ready to eat product are not going to fall under the requirement to evaluate environmental pathogens in their hazard analysis. But, and I maybe should have made this really big and bolded, but all equipment and utensils used in manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food must be designed and maintained to protect against allergen cross-contact and cross-contamination. That is a cut and paste out of the CGMPs, and it applies to all foods. As one of my predecessors, Mickey Parrish, used to say in venues like this, it's never okay to add pathogens to a not ready-to-eat product because it's made in an insanitary environment. That's never okay. Okay, so we do have, I was asked to do a FSMA update. And the irony of the FSMA update is we're working on a lot of guidance that hopefully will be out soon. And I know that's a chuckle word, soon. But there is a lot of work going on getting the remaining guidances finished and out. So looking back at what guidances have come out recently, this is the one that has most recently come out related to FSMA, and it's really around enforcement policies. You know, these are an extension of enforcement policies or additional enforcement policy. These are extensions of policy discretion for different activities. And I'm not going to go into great depth in this. If you're interested, I encourage you to get it. It's not a long guidance document. But basically, there are 3 areas of enforcement discretion that are talked about. The first one applies to firms that are co-manufacturers. And this has been a topic that has been discussed for a long time as it relates to supply chain programs, specifically when brand owners are maintaining part of the supplier approval, supplier verification activities for the raw materials going to the co-manufacturer. So the enforcement discretion here applies when that brand owner is, 1, doing the activity, and that 2, the co-manufacturer is identified and documenting that within their food safety program. The second one here, enforcement discretions around the intentional adulteration rule. There is enforcement discretion discussed here, namely for activities that would fall under a farm, because the farms are not subject to the intentional adulteration rule. But then there's also a discretion policy for times when a firm has had something happen, something minor, and they've taken corrective actions, and that corrective action has fixed the issue. The enforcement discretion is, as written, the intentional adulteration rule would require a complete reanalysis of the mitigation strategy or the food safety, defense plan as a whole. And so the enforcement discretion is saying if that corrective action is taken and it solves the problem, then you don't have to reanalyze as required in the rule. And then the third one here is about taking enforcement discretion and making it clear that if a firm that's a supplier is subject to a different enforcement discretion than who they're selling their material to, that receiving facility would also be exempt from doing verification against that requirement. So again, if you're interested in those, take a look. None of these enforcement policy decisions reduce the importance or requirements of hygienic design and maintaining food contact surfaces in a manner that they don't contribute to contamination. If you're interested, there is a website out there that is, this is the title of the website, Foods Program Guidance Under Development. So if you Google that with FDA, it will come up probably number 1 or 2. And what this is each year the agency will put out the guidance documents that we intend to work on over the course of the next year. This is not the complete list. This is the list of the guidance documents related to FSMA. There's also things out there for nutrition. There's things out there for food defense, general food safety. This isn't an exhaustive list of the only things that we're working on, nor is it a commitment that we're always going to deliver each one of these each year. Of course, we have to react to things that happen, and things get prioritized and deprioritized. But if you're interested in, at least at the beginning of the year, what we thought we were going to accomplish over this year, these are the guidance documents that we made public. So I want to switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about work that we're doing in the Office of Food Safety that we call prevention strategies. So why develop a prevention strategy? So more foodborne illness outbreaks are going to be detected due to enhanced disease attribution. I think you know this. There's been an increase in use of whole genome sequencing. It's been easier to identify outbreaks that maybe previously wouldn't have been identified. There's been a lot of work on how food questionnaires are conducted and how people who have gotten sick, the types of questions and the type of investigation to link back. There's been tremendous advances in traceback. When you're trying to say, okay, I've got these people, where did they buy food, where did they visit? The ability to trace back and find commonalities has gotten exponentially better. So we're identifying more outbreaks than we have before. So we need a structured process to transition as outbreaks are investigated, and namely I'm talking about the outbreaks that are picked up and investigated by FDA's Center for Outbreak Response and Evaluation. When those are completed, the outbreak has stopped, eventually that's going to transition from response into the Office of Food Safety, where we're going to pick it up from a prevention. What do we need to know to be able to prevent this from happening again? So what gaps in understanding do we have? Do we know enough about why something happened to be able to prevent it? Is there research that needs to be done by the agency or elsewhere that needs to be done to understand? What are the activities that we can do based on that learning to resolve some of the gaps and then prevent these outbreaks from happening? It's an opportunity for us to reach out and engage stakeholders. Stakeholders in academia, stakeholders in industry, stakeholders maybe in outside of the United States, to bring clarity toward the prevention activities. And then it's also an opportunity to make progress against the Healthy People Goals 2030. If you've watched those, you know, namely when you're talking about listeria and some of those other pathogens, it's going to take work and effort to bend the curve to be able to meet those 2030 goals. So what is a prevention strategy? As I said, as things move from response into the office, it is an affirmative, deliberate approach that we take to limit or prevent the recurrence of a root cause. These strategies can incorporate a lot of things. And, you know, we're asked a lot, well, aren't you just talking about going out and doing more inspections? You know, isn't this just about, you know, compliance enforcement type? Well, no, that's a piece of it. That could be a piece of it. But there's a lot more, and we're looking at all of the different activities that we may need to take to be able to prevent things from happening. Our goal is that we're going to develop a prevention strategy for every outbreak that CORE investigates. And that means there's a lot of them. That means there's a lot of work to do. So we have to prioritize the ones that we're working on from an execution standpoint. To give you an idea, these are the current prevention strategies that we have developed. Some of these are still developing. Some of these have been worked on for a while. You won't see some of the more recent ones, namely infant formula is not up here on the list. I expect at some point in the near future, infant formula will be up here on the list. One of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to is you look across this list, you know, there's a lot of produce-related outbreaks. And I want to draw your attention to things like leafy greens, onions, melons, mushrooms. You know, as you go through this list, there's some common themes involved in root cause, and it goes back to hygienic design. Produce is an area where there is a great opportunity for improvements in hygienic design. And we see this, you know, as it played out, as we did the root cause, as we, you know, said, what did we learn from these outbreak investigations? There were elements of equipment design that contributed to each and every one of those outbreaks. So just an example, this is just a high-level overview of the prevention strategy that is in place for Listeria monocytogenes and imported specialty mushrooms. These are the Anaki mushrooms. And like I said, they involve the three phases here, phase one being communication, stakeholder engagement. There's quite a bit of work that we need to do. These are imported items. So making sure that the produce safety rule and our requirements are actually in the language of the countries where these items are being imported from. Outreach on differences in how mushrooms are consumed. When we talk to some of the authorities in the countries where these are imported from, you know, these products are typically cooked in those countries. And a lot of the uses here in the United States involves these products being cooked, but not all of it. There's a lot of people who like to put these things on salads and eat them without cooking. And that is a little bit of a difference in how these are consumed here than in other places. So engaging with some of those authorities where these products come from is an important aspect of this. Targeted research, regulatory activities, you know, certainly these are going to be on import alert. We're going to be looking at them when they come in. That is part of our strategy. And we need research to better understand Listeria monocytogenes and Anaki. You know, what are the practices in growing and harvesting and handling these types of produce? I know there's a student out there somewhere that is working on this as part of their graduate program, so thank you for that. I'll be looking for your research in time. And then the last one here, the long-term targeted extension. So how do we facilitate taking the things that are learned and getting them into the hands of what's probably going to be farmers in countries overseas that's going to make the difference in this particular example. So the last area that I have today, the new era of smarter food safety. We're not going to talk about the whole thing. So the new era of smarter food safety is really the agency's new approach to food safety, leveraging technology and other tools to create a safer and more digital and traceable food system. Smarter food safety, you know, we talk a lot about technology and that gets a lot of the press, but it's more than technology. It's also about making things simple, more effective, and taking a more modern approach. And it's about culture. It builds on the work that we've done with the Food Safety Modernization Act. This isn't the next initiative, and FSMA is a thing of the past. FSMA is always going to be part of the foundation of our food system. The new era is really about how do we build onto those foundations to build a better, safer food supply. There are 4 areas within the new era strategy, and I encourage you, if you haven't already, FDA has put out a blueprint. You know, it is the new era for smarter food safety blueprint. If you Google that or put that in a search engine, it will come up. And a lot of the material that you're going to see here is directly right out of that. There are 4 core elements in our smarter new era for smarter food safety. The first is that tech-enabled traceability. The second one is around smarter tools and approaches for prevention and outbreak response. You know, that's sort of where the prevention strategy work that we're doing in the Office of Food Safety fits into the new era model. There's an area around new business models and retail modernization. You know, as food is delivered to consumers in a different way, and new business models are created, how do we adjust to that? How do we make sure that those new models aren't presenting food safety issues that need to be addressed? And then the last one here, and I'll spend some time talking about this, is food safety culture. So what is food safety culture? That's kind of the first question, when you start talking about it, is what do we mean by food safety culture? And there's quite a bit of definitions out there. I put 2 of them up here just as starters. So, the aggregation of prevailing, relatively constant, learned, shared attitudes, values, and beliefs contributing to hygiene behaviors within a particular food handling environment. And I think for me, as I read that definition, one of the key words there is learned. Because it's learned, it also implies that it can be changed, it can be influenced, it can be manipulated. And then, I borrowed the definition from the GFSI document, which many of you are familiar with, the shared values, beliefs, and norms that affect mindset and behavior toward food safety in, across, and throughout an organization. And the reason why I put this one up here is to remind that, yes, we talk a lot about food safety culture in the context of a manufacturing environment. And we talk a lot about food safety culture in the context of, is an operator on the floor going to make the right decision? Are they going to choose to take the time to clean a piece of equipment the right way? Or are they going to shortcut? And those are very important food safety concepts. Those are very important cultural concepts. I came out of industry in mainly corporate positions. So what speaks to me here is also the in, across, and throughout an organization. A lot of times, food safety culture conversations start at the floor, and then they go right to the top. And you hear about the C-suite. How do you get the CEO on board? How do you get, the president of a business on board? That across and throughout the organization, you have to pay attention to the middle, particularly in big companies. And this is based on my experience with companies. A lot of times it's easy to get the CEO on board. In a lot of companies, that's not a hard thing to do, to get the CEO to say, yes, I support food safety. Where it gets challenging is when you get lower to the P&L owners, the middle management, the people who are on the hook for meeting the financial goals of the organization. Those are the ones where you have the hardest time influencing, depending on your organization. So don't forget the middle. Don't forget the throughout the organization. So our goals as FDA for food safety culture, we're looking to promote food safety culture throughout the food system. We're looking to further promote food safety culture through the agency and develop and promote smarter food safety consumer education campaigns. So where does that start? Well, it starts by doing research. Research on food safety culture. What are the challenges, the barriers, the opportunities to influence attitudes and modify behaviors related to food safety culture? This has already started in the agency. We've already done some literature reviews. We've already done a scoping of what is out there in the food safety culture space to start to understand what is available already and what needs to be built. And there will be more to come on that. Internal food safety culture at FDA, of course, we're not immune to this. We are part of the food safety system as well. So how do we think about things? What is the influence of how FDA views food safety culture, views different aspects of food safety that impact how industry is able to execute? Certainly, we're going to encourage and support a culture of food safety in the establishments that we regulate. I know this is an area where, how do you build that into an FDA inspection? What exactly is FDA going to look at and assess culture? And those are all good questions. We are early days in this, and there are answers to that. But these are things that we're considering as we look at food safety culture. There is a webinar series. Ironically, the third one of these is happening today. So if you're interested, this is a collaboration between FDA and a group called Stop Foodborne Illness. There has already been 2. I believe these are available online. You can go and register and listen to these. But they're going to happen about every quarter with different topics. These aren't, as you look across here, these aren't just FDA speakers. These are folks in industry sharing their experience, sharing the things that have worked for them. So I encourage you to go out and pay attention to this webinar series as it happens. Consumer education, identifying new messages, understanding that the consumer has a role in food safety as well. And so how do we continue to build messaging to develop an understanding of food safety practices, food safety behaviors by the consumer? These are just as important as everything else that we've talked about, because we can do a lot of things right and then have it fail when it's right at the almost to consumption phase. So 2 bullets here that I wanted to hit on real quick. And these are, for the most part, copy and paste statements right out of the New Era for Smarter Food Safety Blueprint. The first one here, dramatic improvements in reducing the burden of foodborne illness cannot be made without doing more to influence the beliefs, attitudes, and most importantly, behaviors of people and actions of organizations. There's one word here that I want to talk about for a few minutes, and it's the most important word in there to me. That is influence. You heard it from Darin earlier this morning. He talked a lot about influence. I'm going to present to you just a little bit of my personal beliefs. In my experience leading food safety in a pretty large organization, my belief is the person within an organization that has the most influence, the most potential influence on food safety culture is the person leading food safety. Now, whether that person chooses to engage in influencing activities or knows how to influence their organization well, to the extent that they know and are willing to do those things makes the most difference, in my opinion, in food safety culture. And that means a lot of times expanding a skill set outside of what we consider the sciences area. All of us are technical people. This is a soft skill, right? These are the things that when you put it on, you bring it up, I want to do this, it goes in an individual development plan. It's not in your #1 goals, but I'm going to say that to me, my belief is that if we want to really make dramatic improvements, what we have to do is focus on the people who have the most potential influence within organizations and really make them good at being able to influence. Now, what does that mean? If I'm a company that competes on cost, the way that I present opportunities and I try to influence my leadership to spend money is going to be different. That's going to be a different language, a different vocabulary than if I'm an organization that is built on service. And if you work for a really big company, you probably have divisions or businesses within businesses that are built differently. So you're going to need to be able to shift and speak differently to those leaders, to those middle management, to be able to get them to respond to what you're trying to get them to. In short, I think as we move forward with this discussion on food safety culture, I think this influence is going to become front and center, and I think it's going to become a topic that we're going to have to stare at and really think about what ways can we really use to increase the knowledge of how food safety professionals can develop influencing skills, can create stories that are successful, can create ways to present food safety initiatives in a way that an organization will rally around it. And then the last one here, collectively, this is all stakeholders, FDA included, needs to ensure that we are doing everything possible to incorporate the lessons we learn from contamination events into prevention efforts and complete our work as fast as possible. That's exactly what we're doing within the Office of Food Safety from prevention strategies. It's exactly what we're going to be looking for from stakeholders as we reach out in those engagement opportunities. So closing, hygienic design is a foundational GMP that underlies FSMA. It was there before. Hygienic design and sanitation deficiencies are among the most frequently cited during preventive control for human food inspections. There are segments of the industry that are farther along, and the work that's been done in dairy is outstanding. You know, the 3A standards are exactly effective for dairy. A lot of them apply outside of dairy. We talked about one category of produce, which may be a segment of the industry that is farther along in implementing. You know, I'd say they're farther along in understanding, not just implementing hygienic design. But there are other categories out there as well that have a lot of work to do. We have to do more to influence the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of people and actions of organizations. And then lastly, we have to work quickly. So with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions if there are any.